Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a customer engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion is part 3 of an ongoing series focused on compliance policy in Microsoft Intune, which of course is part of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Today's discussion will focus on the ability to integrate compliance policy assessment between Intune and ConfigMgr whenever we're working with Windows devices. Here's our agenda. We're going to talk about what ConfigMgr integration is. Again, all of this is related to integration with Intune compliance policy. So what is ConfigMgr integration into Intune compliance policy? Why do we care about that? And then what are the requirements of integration? How does it work exactly? What are some of the scenarios that this might play in? And then finally, how do we configure this? And then we'll see this happen in front of us in action here. We'll wrap up with some troubleshooting tips and tricks. All right, so what is ConfigMgr integration? Well, ConfigMgr integration, first of all, is all about Windows, right? So Intune manages Windows, iOS, macOS, Android. ConfigMgr really manages Windows devices, and so the integration between Configuration Manager and Intune will be applicable only to Windows devices. Intune focused. So compliance in the case of an integrated scenario will be owned by Intune, and whenever Intune goes and calculates compliance for the device, you can configure it to go ask Configuration Manager what it thinks, and then the result, compliance result, is a combination of Intune and Configuration Manager data. Let me drill into that a little bit more. So I mentioned that Intune owns compliance. It does, right? So this is, you probably are inferring already, this works because you have set up co-management between Intune and Configuration Manager for your Windows devices. And so in order to make this setting work, you will need to shift the workload for compliance over to Intune, and then Intune will own the overall reporting of compliance, but it will know to go and ask Configuration Manager. You'll see that setting here in just a minute. So what is Configuration Manager integration? Well, it's ConfigMgr integrated, right? So that means, again, co-management. The compliance workload shifted over into being owned by Intune. And then one other thing, so we introduced the ability to do this compliance assessment in combination between Configuration Manager and Intune. I forget which version. In 1910 of Configuration Manager, the compliance assessment capability in Configuration Manager communicating with Intune was tweaked to allow you to include configuration baselines as well, and we'll see that in just a minute, right? So right now, just so you know, the recording is going to be done with Intune certainly, and then Configuration Manager 2006. But we did add that ability in 1910. You'll see that more in just a minute. So why do you care about this? Well, compliance is huge. We've had that as a central theme as we've worked through this series, right? In the world where we're combining Configuration Manager and Intune to do this compliance assessment, we get some really cool things. You know, robust assessment, being able to combine the power of Config Manager and all of the configurations that are possible in Config Manager that can be included in compliance. Again, show you how to do that in just a minute. Very flexible situation where we can assess compliance broadly, or we can choose to hone in on specific details. We can be very precise and understand what compliance results are yielding the overall either compliant or not compliant, right? If your device is not compliant, why is it not compliant? Is it not compliant because of an Intune setting? Is it not compliant because of a Configuration Manager setting? What is the exact situation, right? And then also, with the integration of Config Manager into the compliance pipeline, you literally can choose anything that you want to be a switch to determine whether a device is compliant. I've mentioned already that you can, as of 1910, include configuration baselines. That opens a lot of possibilities. Again, you'll see that configuration baselines can have other configuration baselines. They will have configuration items on them. They can have software updates on them, right? Basically, in that world, anything on the system you want to check, you could. So file system as an example, XML as an example, registry as an example, scripts that you might want to run could be an example, right? And on we go. Okay, so what are the requirements of this? Well, certainly you need, Azure AD Premium I put at the top, right? Because of conditional access. If you're going to be doing conditional access, then that's what you need, Azure AD Premium. Conditional access is not directly tied into compliance, though compliance and conditional access typically go hand in hand, right? You certainly need Intune. You need Configuration Manager. You need compliance settings. So there's two big buckets under here. Under compliance settings, you have a node called Compliance Policy. You'll see that in a minute. You must have a setting in Compliance Policy here in order for Config Manager to participate in the overall compliance assessment. You'll see that in a minute. You can optionally choose to add configuration baselines. I already mentioned that. Configuration baselines will include typically configuration items. They can also include other configuration baselines. You can make this as detailed or as simple as you would like it to be. Okay, let's start stepping toward the fun stuff. So how does this work? So here's a diagram I tried to put together to give you a high-level view of how this actually works. So here we have Intune sitting in Azure. Here we have Configuration Manager Site Server. And we do have co-management between the two set up. So Intune and Configuration Manager are linked. We have compliance policy configured in Intune. We have compliance policy, configuration items, baselines, whatever configured in Configuration Manager to participate in the compliance assessment. Right? We have a Config Manager client that is managed by Config Manager, either directly, meaning the device is on-prem, or it could even be managed through the Cloud Management Gateway. Either way, no problem. And so then we have Intune that will go out and assess compliance. So Intune will include the configuration manager data to come up with a combined compliance state, right? Again, very high level. There's certainly detail in here that you need to understand that we'll go through as we continue. So what are the scenarios where config manager integration for compliance assessment might be interesting, right? So conditional access always is going to be a scenario with compliance assessment, because conditional access uses compliance as one of several gatekeepers to control access to corporate data. There's additional compliance opportunities whenever you include configuration manager data. We've inferred them already. Configuration baselines, configuration items, things that include software updates, application installs, maybe the build of a corporate OS. So imagine a scenario where you only want to allow devices that have an approved operating system that has been deployed and certified as a corporate operating system to be able to connect to the network and corporate data. You can do that if you include config manager assessment. Disk encryption. So this is certainly one that can be managed through both native Intune and config manager, but I included here just as another option. Third-party software. On. We can just keep talking about different things that we could include. And so the sky really is the limit. Those are just a few to kind of get you thinking. And then finally getting to the fun stuff. How do we go about configuring this? Well, there's a couple of places. So let's start with config manager. Here is the site server, and let's start here. So first, I want to show you in the config manager console here. If I go into administration, and then as soon as that comes up, cloud services. Okay, so administration, and then cloud services, and co-management, right? So first, I just want to show you that co-management is enabled. I want to show you the settings for co-management, a couple of them anyway. And just complete tangent. This is where you configure co-management. It's also where you configure other things now, like cloud attach, kind of things. Come on, open up. All right. Okay, so if we go over to enablement, you'll see that I have turned all of my systems on so that they will be enrolled in Intune through co-management, right? You don't have to do that. You can do other things. By the way, this is not a co-management session, right? I want to show you these things so you understand how things are configured. There is a co-management session that I did that you can go look at if you want to see all the detail about co-management, but this is not. I just show this to you for completeness. So since I've mentioned that all devices should be enrolled in Intune, I can't configure a collection here. If I did want to have a pilot group, that's where I can configure the collection, right? Anyway, so that's here. And then in terms of workloads, I have shifted compliance policy completely and totally to Intune, right? So that's my co-management configuration. Now, I have also configured some things in Configuration Manager to assess compliance. So let me show that to you while I'm here. If I go under Assets and Compliance, strangely, and then go down to Compliance Settings node, you're going to see there's a bunch of stuff under the Compliance Settings node. The key thing that I care about is compliance policies. So if I expand that, well, actually, I don't even have to expand that. If I click on that, you're going to see a couple of compliance policies that I have configured. Before I show you the ones that I've configured, let me walk you through this for just a minute. If I go create compliance policy, there's a few things I'm going to do real quick just to show you. So the setting here would be to make sure that the device is managed with the Configuration Manager client here. And then next, I'm going to apply this to Windows 10 because Windows 10 is what I'm worried about with Intune largely in Windows. And then I'm going to add a new compliance policy. And I'm going to see this drop down, the condition drop down, right? So you will choose one of these conditions, and you might have multiple compliance policies like what I have, but these are the ones that historically, prior to 1910, you could choose from, right? And there's some good stuff here, making sure that you have anti-malware. Here's BitLocker, drive encryption, can do that with Intune as well. Health attestation service can do that with Intune as well. Apps or software updates, applications that have been installed with a day threshold, right? All of those good stuff. But it really, while it augmented what you could do with Intune, especially the software updates and apps, it really didn't give as much capability as what you could get, right? Possibly with some of the other things like configuration baselines, until we added this, include configuration baselines in the policy assessment. That again was put in 1910. So what you'll see, let me get rid of this now, and I'll just show you the ones that I have set up. What I have here are two things. One is that I want to include my configuration baseline. So this is a compliance policy that opens the door, so to speak, to being able to include the compliance baselines in my assessment, right? So that's just from the drop down right here, no problem. That's what I just showed you. And then the other one that I just put in because it's easy is to require BitLocker. That was from that drop down that I showed you as well. It was one of those items that was already there, right? So with those two, I have two compliance assessments already. But with this one, I need to also go configure some configuration baselines that I can then use for assessment. So to show you that, I'm just going to scroll up here to configuration baselines. And you'll see that I have one that's enabled, and specifically it's just a demo configuration baseline. But let's go look at what's on this thing. First of all, so again, this also, well, just like this isn't a co-management session, it's not a session on compliance settings and configuration items and configuration baselines, but to understand this, just a little bit about it. So the configuration baseline is what you will send out and deploy to your devices, and that baseline is what's going to be assessed to determine if that baseline is compliant or not. And then that baseline compliance will be factored into the overall compliance for the Configuration Manager client, and then that will be reported to Intune and combined with what Intune thinks, right? So here's one thing to understand and know about baselines. Baselines can include a number of things, as you'll see here. If I go into properties of the baseline, you'll see that the conditions can include configuration items. That's what I have here. They could also include other configuration baselines. They could also include software updates. So bottom line, configuration baselines can have a bunch of things potentially on them. And the way these baselines work, they are evaluated as a unit. The idea is if you configure a baseline, the expectation is that you need all of the items configured on the baseline to be compliant in order to show compliance. And so if you have 50 things configured on the baseline and one of them is non-compliant, then the entire baseline will be non-compliant. That non-compliance is what is reported to Intune when it asks, and the device will be non-compliant until that baseline is remediated, right? Again, very high-level discussion, a lot more detail in the session I did on compliance settings, so take a look at that if you're interested. Notice, though, that this is configured. Here's my configuration item. I have my deployment out here, so this is deployed to my collection. Now, let me show you, though, creating this for a minute. Actually, instead of creating one, let me just show you this one again on the general page. So if I go to properties, back on it. So there's two things that are really, really important to make sure that you have selected if you're going to use this for compliance assessment with Intune. This setting, always apply the baseline, even for co-managed devices or clients, must be set in order for this to even go to co-managed devices. And then finally, evaluate this baseline as part of compliance policy assessment has to be enabled. Because you might have compliance or configuration baselines or configuration items, whatever, that you do want to have in your configuration manager environment, yet you do not want to include them as part of overall compliance. They may be for something else, right? You don't want them reported to Intune and factored in that way. So yeah, that's completely up to you. But if you want them factored into Intune, these two have to be configured, and this is deployed no problem to my collection of, or to my device that I'm going to show you in a minute. And it also has, I showed you this has the configuration item on it. I'm not going to detail this again. This isn't a configuration item, configuration baseline setting, but all this does is this one looks for the software registry key to be present on the device, right? So if I just quickly look under compliance rules, you'll see here that it's going to look in the registry key, must exist on devices, so on, right? Again, that's all I'll show you here because it really doesn't matter. The bottom line that we need to understand is that get this out of the way, is that from ConfigMgr, we will have 3 compliance-related items that will be assessed as part of assessing compliance on the ConfigMgr client and then ultimately reported to Intune, okay? Now, let's go to Intune and look at what we have configured to make this all kind of come together, right? So if I go into the Endpoint Manager console, let me grab that, pull it in. First of all, if I navigate into Devices here, and then I go to Windows Devices, right? First of all, I want to show you this device because here's my Windows device, and I can tell right away a couple of things just by looking at it in the console. First, it is co-managed, so Intune will tell me this device is co-managed, meaning I know that I can put compliance on it from both Intune and Configuration Manager. But then also notice I will see under compliance a value listed as non-compliant, right? Not compliant. The very fact that I see a value listed here under compliance means that Intune owns the compliance assessment. If I had not shifted the workload for compliance to Intune, then what I would instead see here is a simple note that says see config manager, right? Because in this case, even though the device is co-managed, the compliance assessment would still be owned by config manager. And so Intune would flag me to say, no, I don't own compliance for that device. Go look at it in config manager if you want to know what compliance is. Once I shift the workload over, the Intune console reflects that and now will show the calculated compliance value, right? All right. Now, what else? So here's how we look now. What else? If we go down to compliance policy, how do I tell Intune to factor config manager in? Well, it's really pretty easy. So here's my compliance policy. I just use the default. You may not want to use the default in a production environment. This isn't my lab, so you could add another one, right? In the previous session, we talked about how the default compliance policy, really nothing is set there at all. It's there to fulfill the requirement that at least a compliance policy be deployed in order for the device to even be allowed in the first place, right? Go back and review part 2 if you want to see that. But here I just used for simplicity the default policy. And if I go to properties and scroll down, you will see that I do have required device compliance from configuration manager. If I edit that, it's a very simple option. I just move this from not configured to required. And then at that stage, again, Intune knows to go talk to configuration manager to understand what is going on the compliance side there. Okay, so that's my setup, and that's how I have everything linked together. So let's get that out of the way. And then let's go actually see how this works in action. So let me grab my device that is being managed. Here it is. Move that in. I'll have to sign into it. So this is my co-managed client. There's a couple of things I just want to show you on this as we get logged in. So if I go into control panel, all right, and then I look at the configuration manager applet here. All right, open that up. Okay, so a couple of key things. First, I see right here that co-management is enabled, so that's a good thing, right? Then I can look at co-management capabilities. So co-management capabilities, if you know how to interpret this, will tell you exactly what's turned on. But even if you don't know how to interpret the numerical value, what you can know is if co-management capabilities is set to 0, your device is not being co-managed, right? Now, you know that it is because it says enabled. And so at the very least, if a device is co-managed, this value in terms of co-management capabilities will be 1, which means the device has been enrolled in Intune, right? But no workloads have been shifted at all. If the device is greater than, or if the capabilities value is greater than 1, then you know at least some workloads, or at least one workload has been shifted. In this case, the only workload that's been shifted is compliance policy, and that's why I have a value of 3. The other thing that you notice here is that this device is an on-prem device, right? Self-signed certs. Self-signed certs don't work in a remote management scenario through the Cloud Management Gateway. You need to have other means of validating that client communication, such as PKI or Azure AD tokens or the bulk registration token. Again, that's another tangent to a session that we're not talking about today. But if those things are interesting, go look at the session that I did on Config Manager Client Bootstrapping and also Cloud Management Gateway, right? So here, we know, in fact, that everything is configured and we're co-managed and we have the compliance workload shifted. Okay, actually staying with the Config Manager applet for just a minute, I want to show you one more thing. Oops, there it is. So if I go to, so we know we're here, right, and we're configured. Now, if I go to configurations, you're going to see that we have 4 configurations applied to the device, and those configurations come through the compliance settings or the configuration, the compliance settings mechanism, right? Now, I mentioned to you whenever I showed you ConfigMgr that there were 3 settings that were being imposed on this device and used in the overall compliance assessment. So what is this 4th one? This 4th one, actually the first one in the list, is a setting that is put on the device, a configuration put on the device when it is co-managed to enable co-management. So item number 1 is for co-management. Then we have item 2, 3, and 4, and we'll see here's my configuration baseline assessment. Here's my assessment to include, here's my, sorry, let me start this way, bottom up. So there's the compliance policy, and that's where you decide whether or not you want to include other things like configuration baseline. So here's my option to include baselines. Here's the baseline that I have included. And then here's also my compliance policy that will look for BitLocker drive encryption, right? And you'll notice that I have assessed all of these. Now, these won't be assessed on a schedule, or you can go assess them manually, no problem. All of these are compliant except for the last one, because there is no BitLocker drive encryption here, right? So let me just show you this for a minute. If I want to evaluate this, I can just click on evaluate, and it's going to go do that. It's in progress. Here in a minute, it will flip over and be done, and non-compliant still will be in place. But even, so that's running. But when this is over, when this is assessed, let me refresh here. When this is assessed, I can also proactively, here we go, still non-compliant. If I'm a technician in the field, or a user, or help desk, or whatever, and I'm working with a user to try to understand, help them understand what's not compliant, whatever, then I can have them come into their client and view reports and be able to see the detail behind this. Now, in my case, this is very simple, right? But here's my baseline, and then here's the setting that's on my baseline. It's giving me a warning, right? Some detail here that will help me understand what might be happening on the device. So this is all that I have configured, and you see that all of these have been evaluated, right, in the past. All right, and so as a reminder, this is that compliance that is being generated by those settings is what Intune will ask for whenever it goes out and talks to ConfigMgr. So the client is going to report that detail up to Configuration Manager in the form of state messages, and then ConfigMgr will record that in the database. So when Intune asks ConfigMgr will see the status of this device as non-compliant. We'll tell Intune, hey, this device, as far as I know, is non-compliant. Intune, even if all of its assessments are compliant, will see ConfigMgr and say, oh, well, I can't call this compliant because ConfigMgr sees it as non-compliant. Therefore, the overall assessment is non-compliant. And just as a reminder, that is what we have here under Windows devices. For my device, it is shown as non-compliant. Now, that's great to know that it's non-compliant based on the rules that I've set up, but how do I remediate that, right? Well, certainly we can go in as IT and kind of understand what our settings are, and then go look at those individual settings on the device and see which one is not in place. But what if my end user is working with the help desk, or they want to look at it themselves? Let me go ahead and get this out of the way. You can do that, right? There's ways to do it. So what is the end user experience? Well, let's start with Software Center, right? Well, actually, let's start with Company Portal. So I'm going to show you Company Portal. This is a Windows device. You do not have to have the Company Portal on your Windows device in order for that device to be managed, right? Having it there allows the user to interact with Intune and with the device and to understand a bit of what's going on, right? in fact, on a tangent, complete tangent, one of the items that you might want to think about in a co-managed world for sure is whether you want to use the company portal or whether you want to use Software Center as the primary interface for the user. Software Center is amazing. You'll see that in a minute. Company portal has come to a lot of parity with Software Center, meaning that whatever you see in terms of apps in Software Center, you'll also see in Company Portal now, right? And so on. Again, that's a bit of a tangent, so I'm not going to go there. But if I want to see my devices, then I can come here and you'll see my Windows system, and its setting cannot access company resources. Why? Because it is not compliant. It was checked an hour ago. So let me go into the device and you'll just get the detail. The device does not meet compliance and security policies. I can go look at more and scroll down a little bit and see a little bit more detail. One or more settings on the device needs to be updated to your organization. It's actually pointing you to Software Center and device compliance to get, frankly, more detail. So this doesn't give you the granular detail that Software Center will. Now, you can do some things to help give that granular detail if you're not wanting to use Software Center, don't have Software Center, whatever the case may be. Again, see part 2 of this series to see a little bit about that. If I want to go trigger an assessment right now, I can do that, right? That will reevaluate compliance and so on. But let's go look at Software Center and see what kind of detail is available there for our end users to know what's going on. So Software Center, not Software Update, Software Center there. All right, so that's going to come up, and there's a device compliance node here that will tell us the detail about it. So we're going to go check compliance and try to resolve any issues. This might take a second or two whenever we first pull it up, so it might take even a couple of minutes for me at this stage. So I'm going to pause this and come back once it's already showing the detail. Okay, so actually that took about 15 more seconds after I paused it. But you see, the device does not comply with corporate security policies. So there's that generic message like you saw in Company Portal. But then update your device security settings, right? So here's, again, that generic message. But notice this. Now I know why it's failing. It's failing because the device is not encrypted. That perfectly aligns with exactly what I was seeing. Let me show you this again. What I was seeing in the ConfigMgr applet. So if I go to configurations, here is my requiring BitLocker. It is the one that is not compliant. So I could tell directly through the applet there, assuming the user has access to Control Panel, which they may or may not, but they do have access to this, and they can see the device is not encrypted, even more detail about it. So Software Center absolutely shows you what's going on more granularly. You can still go and check compliance again if you want to, and so on, right? So that's a bit about the end user experience and how that all lines up, right? Okay, so pretty cool stuff, at least I think so. So starting to wrap things up, turning our mind to troubleshooting tips and tricks, right? So troubleshooting in this arena is a little bit more complicated because we're combining Intune and ConfigMgr in the assessment, right? So know that the value for compliance in Intune will rely on the most recent data available from both tools. So I mentioned in part 2 that compliance is assessed on a device whenever the device checks in for policy. Now that can be on a schedule, which is roughly every 8 hours-ish. It varies per device. Actually on Windows, I think it is 8 hours. I have to go back and check. But it's by default a longer time frame than you might be accustomed to with ConfigMgr. You could also trigger it manually from the device. You could trigger it manually from the Intune console. On the ConfigMgr policy, we know how to go trigger that. We just go into the applet and we can trigger it. We can also trigger it from the ConfigMgr console. So if you want the latest and greatest view of data, make sure that you trigger assessment on that device while you're looking at it, and know that it may take a few minutes for the compliance status in the Intune console to reflect what's the latest and greatest. And when I did it in my testing, it took about 2.5 minutes for the status in Intune to update. That might vary a little bit, but just so you know, right? In Intune, I've spent a lot of time talking about this, but I'll show it to you again. If we want to troubleshoot Intune and understand what's actually going on with Intune side of things in terms of compliance, I can come into the troubleshooting mode, right here. And so I will have to select a user. So in my case, I will select me, the user on the device, so to speak. So in my case, that's me, and here. And then I will scroll down and, well, say, okay. Then I will scroll down and look at the compliance policy that's assigned. I can see that all here, right? And then I can also see the devices that I might care about. So in this case, I care about this device. So I'll click into it, and I'll scroll down a little bit, down to device compliance there. And so here, I'm able to review all of the compliance that is applied to this device. I can see where it's coming from. I can see different detail about it. If I want to drill in, I can see all. So maybe there's a compliance policy that's assigned that I'm not anticipating, right? And so I can see that here and understand that detail as well. So it helps me have a complete view. Now, on the config manager side, I can use the config manager console. And so specifically, let me open it back. On the config manager console side, just the normal mechanisms. Oh, wait, that's the client. That's why I don't have it. Let me get that out of the way. Sorry. Helps if I get the right device, right? On the config manager side, if I go into the console, normal mechanisms apply here for troubleshooting. So if I go under monitoring as an example, I can see the deployments that I've made for these configuration items. All right, so if I go down to deployments and sort by type, then where is it? Okay, so if I sort by type, you'll see some. I'm not going to sort. Here's for example, configuration policy that is out there, and I'll be able to see maybe what's going on with it, what's been assessed, et cetera, right? Then I also have the traditional logs that I can go look at. And so, for example, there might be, I'm not going to dig into these greatly, but just to show you, one of them that I want to start with, perhaps, is co-management handler. Why? Because this device does need to be co-managed in order for this to work. So if I go under Windows and then look at the log. Sorry. See, I'm getting confused on the devices now. I need to pull back in my Windows device. That's my site server. So if I go on under Windows and logs on my device, that's where the logs are that I want to see. All right, and here we go. Windows CCM log. So co-management handler is one that I care about. Right there, and I can go open it up and see the detail about checking for co-management status and whether the device is enrolled in NDM. Here it's provisioned already, it's merging policy, and so on, right? So a lot of different things I can get there. There's also the traditional logs that are out there for compliance settings like DCM agent, DCM reporting. There's this DCM WMI stuff, depending on what you're doing. There's compliance handler, there's CI agent, and on we go for those kind of details in terms of knowing what we can troubleshoot on configuration manager, right? And just a reminder, the control panel applet, I showed you that already for configuration manager. You can confirm the device is co-managed, confirm that it has a workload shifted to it, in this case, compliance policy. And so on, right? Okay, so as we wrap up here, just a couple of tips and tricks. So again, reminder, compliance assessment is a combination of Intune and ConfigMgr results. It adds, again, a little bit of complexity, but as long as you understand how these two fit together, not a big deal. And also just want to say again, if you are troubleshooting a compliance-related issue is showing not compliant when you think it should be compliant, you want to figure out what's going on, that's doable. Just make sure that you start with the latest set of compliance data. So trigger an assessment fresh on the device from the Intune side, from the ConfigMgr side. Let it have a couple of minutes to come to convergence, and then you'll be able to understand what's going on. All right. That said, we are done with this particular discussion. The next part in this series, we'll talk about conditional access a bit. That would be a fairly simple one. Again, compliance is a one component of several components of conditional access. I just want to show you that in this next session. So we will wrap it up here, and we will see you for part 4.